Compilations weren't much of a thing at the beginning of the 16-bit generation. Cartridges were small and the cost was just too prohibitive. As time went on, however, we did begin to see the odd compilations show up, typically consisting of groups of smaller titles or even games from the previous generations. CD-ROM based technology opened things up a bit, allowing not just multiple titles on one disc, but new music as well. And really, that was the best we could have hoped for at the time. Thankfully, the 32-bit generation had a bit more freedom thanks to an unprecedented amount of power and more efficient CD-ROMs. Not only could they do arcade ports more justice than ever, but they could hold a lot more of them. Of course, it wasn't only arcade games that would get the compilation treatment, as we saw a number of console games show up as well. And that's our topic for this episode. I've gathered an impressive list of compilations that you can get for the Sega Saturn. Most of the games you'll see here originally came out a number of years before the Saturn, and given the machine's incredible two-dimensional prowess, the end result was often worth some attention. In this episode, we will go over most of the compilations that were available for the Sega Saturn, talk some about how they turned out and if they're worth playing today. Hope you guys enjoy Compilations and the Sega Saturn. In 1998, the Capcom Generation series of games began releasing, containing some of the developers' most popular games from the 80s and early 90s. In Volume 1, you got the Shoot 'em Ups, 1942, 1943, and 1943 Kai. In Volume 2, you got Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Volume 3 included a bunch of really old games with XX's, Pirate Ship Higemaru, Sun, and Vulgus. Volume 4 had 3 run-and guns, Commando, Mercs, and Gunsmoke. The final volume was number 5, and it had Street Fighter II The World Warrior, its upgrade Champion Edition, and its upgrade Hyper Fighting. The quality of these ports is overall excellent, but does come with some things you should know. The resolution some of these games run in differs from the arcade originals, so there are some issues with things appearing in a slightly different screen size. Games that used vertical orientations have modes that support that, but they still appear slightly different. These types of resolution changes would affect a great many of the releases in this video, so be aware they exist. Fortunately, the visuals are very sharp otherwise, and nearly all of these games play great. Load times can be a bit long for games so old, and a few of them actually have slowdown, but it tends to be fleeting and easily tolerable. These can be fun if loaded onto an ODE or played from a burned disc, but if you are searching for accuracy at home, I advise sticking with MAME. My favorite of this bunch is definitely the Street Fighter disc. It looks and plays great, and if you are a fighting game fan that owns a Saturn, it's a great trip down memory lane. To be frank, however, by the time these releases hit in 1998, Capcom had a ton of games from the late 80s I would have much rather have seen. Capcom kept the compilation train chugging along in 1999 with Dungeons & Dragons Collection. This was a multi-disc set that had Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara. They were both side-scrolling hack-and-slash beat-em-ups where you could use magic, make choices that affected your paths, and featured co-op multiplayer. There were also multiple characters you could choose to play, each with their own stats and abilities. Shadow over Mystara is the newer and more impressive of the two offerings here, so much so that it required the 4MB RAM expansion cart for all that gorgeous two-dimensional animation. Both of these are excellent fun and well worth a look, more so if you have someone to play with. While I was really impressed with these ports overall, there are a few issues that you should be aware of. First, the original 4-player support has been cut down to 2. This is less likely an issue with the Saturn's ability to handle it, and more a problem with memory. That was just too much even for 4 megabytes of extra RAM. These games also have copious amounts of loading, and I mean it's more often and much longer than you'd like. This became my single biggest issue and something you'll get quite tired of. Even so, you really have to admire Capcom trying these games during that generation, and it was the Saturn that got the call to do it. The graphics and animation are all still impressive all these years later, and the adventure itself inspired some of the best games of the genre. Falcom and JVC came together in 1997 to release Falcom Classics, a group of RPGs previously released on various platforms, but redone here to take advantage of the Saturn's increased capabilities. In the first volume, you got Dragon Slayer, Xanadu, and Ys. In Volume 2, you got Ys 2 and Temple of the Sun Azteca 2. The roadblock on this one was that both volumes were Japanese releases only, so the text-heavy stories and stats were lost on me and thus made it difficult to play. For that reason, I wouldn't normally include them because most of my audience doesn't speak Japanese themselves. Fortunately, thanks to the incredible Saturn community, work has begun on translating some of these titles. Ancient Ys Vanished Omens is now playable to English-speaking audiences in all its classic glory. Here it gets a pretty big facelift over where I first played it on the Master System and Turbo CD. You get more detail, more color, and more animation. The translation quality has a few issues, but I won't look a gift horse in the mouth. This was a much appreciated project to get an incredible game playable for many of us on our favorite platform. I'd love to review the fully translated compilation of all these games someday, but until then, here are a few gameplay snippets. Konami released the Gradius Deluxe Pack in 1996, a combo of Gradius and Gradius 2. These are two incredible shoot-'em-ups that I really loved back then. Both do a great overall job of recreating the arcade experience. I always enjoyed the power-up system in these titles. Being able to choose what you wanted and not being locked to a certain weapon icon was quite refreshing. If you wanted to concentrate on your ground attacks first, you could do that. These games also had some fantastic soundtracks. They really fit the mood of a shooter like this. Visually, both were among the better looking titles at the time of their releases. Big levels, big enemies, and death and destruction everywhere. There are some tweaks here and there to the Saturn versions on this disc, including a new CGI intro, but they both are otherwise spot on in terms of gameplay. The second game here is nasty difficult in spots, and they have that old design frustration of a death setting you back a bit. Still, these were really important additions to growing the genre into what it became years later. Both are absolute must-plays. In 1996, Irem Arcade Classics was released on Saturn thanks to a company called IMAX. This disc included 10-Yard Fight, Spartan X, which is just Kung Fu Master, and ZIPPY Race, which was also known as Moto Race USA. While it's always cool to revisit Kung Fu Master, this group of games couldn't be more boring. The arcade version of 10-Yard Fight was never a particularly good game, and by 1996, there were so many better options for the sport available. I mean, even on the Saturn you could play Quarterback Club 96. ZIPPY Race was a combination of a top-down and forward-scrolling racing game that looked kinda cool in 1983, but on Saturn, it was a complete waste of power. The fact of the matter was that having just 3 games with this type of age on them and asking the price of a full retail release was ludicrous. There should have been at least 5 to 10 entries on a product like this if you were going that far back and at this price point. Where was Moon Patrol? Where was Kid Nicky Radical Ninja? Where was Tropical Angel? I want to be clear that if you like these games in the arcade, the ports here are very nice, but it just wasn't a good pickup for the money. It needed more games to meet its asking price and hold your attention. In 1998, Konami took its 3 PlayStation Antiques MSX collections and combined them into a single package for the Saturn called Konami Antiques MSX Collection Ultra Pack. This was a group of 30 titles that originally showed up on Microsoft's MSX computer in Japan. And man, this is how you do a collection of really old games. You load it down with so many options, the replay value is there on sheer variety alone. Of course they all look and play accurately, but I really wish that Konami had added some quality of life improvements in the form of a smooth scrolling option in the settings. Most of these titles are choppy as can be and do not scroll well at all. Some are even slideshows. Fortunately, there are a few forward scrolling choices that are easily the darlings of the bunch. These are still quite playable and look as good as anything on the NES or Master System. The strength of this one is undeniably the number of games you get. There are some true classics here, and while none of them are arcade perfect due to their MSX roots, many still play fine. Again, the erratic scrolling knocks it back a few notches, but if you have ever wanted a nice compilation of what the MSX offered from Konami, this is a fun look at the platform. Midway had to of course get a compilation or 2 out, and we'll start with arcade's greatest hits, the Atari Collection. Here you get Asteroids, Battle Zone, Centipede, Missile Command, Super Breakout, and Tempest. These Atari arcade ports had some serious age on them, but Digital Eclipse did an excellent job bringing them home. It could have included a few more releases given the price point, but at least they weren't as stingy as the Irem Collection we looked at earlier. What's interesting about this one is not the game list itself, but rather the peripherals it supported. Despite not being released in Japan, it had full support for the Saturn Mission Stick, the Saturn Shuttle Mouse, and the Saturn Floppy Disk Drive. While the sound and visuals are about as old school as you can get here, the gameplay is spot on, and you have many options to really take advantage of your control method of choice. There's a number of you that just can't go back this far, but for those of you that can, this is an excellent representation of Golden Age arcade goodness. Konami dropped Parodius Deluxe Pack early in the life of the Saturn, with the Japanese release coming in May of 1995. It included the first 2 games in the Parodius series, Parodius and Fantastic Journey. As most of you know, these were parodies of the Gradius series, using much more cartoonish and lighthearted visuals with humorous animations. These types of games are often called cute-em-ups for this reason, and they both certainly fit that description. Aside from the comical presentation, they play quite similar to Konami's other series and are just as much fun. You get to choose between multiple ships, and each has different attacks that you can employ. I very much like these games and still play them every so often because it's one of the few times Konami really let loose and supported a Sega console with its older titles. Unfortunately for those of us in North America, Konami canceled that release, so outside of Japan, the only region to receive it were the PAL territories. This was a shame because the gameplay and visuals are drop dead gorgeous, and you had to love that trademark soundtrack. Add a friend and you can play it forever. Highly recommended, as much today as it was back then. My favorite of the Konami compilations was definitely Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus. This pack included the shoot 'em up classic Salamander and the Japanese version of Life Force. For those curious, the original Salamander had been changed for its North American launch and called Life Force. This included some visual and story changes that put the setting inside an alien life form. The Japanese take on this version introduced a Gradius-style power-up system as the biggest change. Both these games were excellent and included both horizontal and vertically scrolling stages. The real meat of this compilation is Salamander 2, however. This is the true sequel to the first and was only a year removed from the arcade when it showed up in this pack. That means you get vastly superior graphics on display with tons of pre-rendered sprites and an amazing amount of transparencies. Of course, depending on how you feel about that sort of thing, this could be seen as a giant negative. What isn't up for debate is the absolutely killer soundtrack. It's the best part of this package and really makes it worth a look. While the archaic gameplay didn't really add anything new to the genre, the music really comes through as motivation enough. Overall, looking at this as a complete package, it offers enough challenge, replayability, and classic gameplay to deserve a place among your physical or digital collections. Again, multiplayer makes everything even better. Sega sported mad wood for the Columns series in the 90s, so it was no surprise that Columns Arcade Collection showed up on the Saturn in 1997. You got the original Columns, Columns 2, Stack Columns, and Columns 97. This was, for better or worse, the very best the Columns series offered up till that point. You guys have played these games plenty, and you already know whether you enjoy them or not. There's nothing I can really add beyond they are indeed pretty much arcade perfect, and they play exactly like they should. Columns 97 was an STV Titan arcade port that was only 9 months removed from its original debut. If you love puzzle games, this does offer quite a bit, but if you played one Columns, you've played them all. At least it sure seemed that way. Perhaps the biggest surprise compilation to be released on the Saturn was 1998's Sega Ages I Love Mickey Mouse and I Love Donald Duck. This was a package deal for the Sega Mega Drive versions of Castle of Illusion and Quackshot. And as you'd expect, the Saturn had no issues at all doing both these titles. I suppose that becomes something of an issue, honestly. While both games look, play, and sound exactly like their old selves, they also feature no upgrades of any kind. No arranged soundtrack option, no improved visuals, no new story cinematics. I mean, you get nothing at all above the original experience. Is that enough to revisit these great games on the Saturn? For me, I played them again happily because they were both really fun titles. But if you wanted something more, you aren't gonna find it here. The Saturn was home to a number of Sega Ages releases that I really enjoyed, but the two Memorial Selection compilations are perhaps the most disappointing. Sega just went too far back for these two releases. Memorial Selection 1 included Flicky, Head On, Pingo, and Up and Down. When this was released in 1997, Sega already had a few ways to play these at home, so being on the Saturn was a complete waste of time. Memorial Selection 2 had a better list that included Doki Doki Penguin Land, Monaco GP, Ninja Princess, Samurai, Sinbad Mystery, and Starjacker. There are a few interesting games on this one, with Ninja Princess being the standout that makes the disc worth owning all by itself. But there is no question that these two entries into the Sega Ages line were wasted opportunities. This should have been a single release with all of these games included, and even then, it should have been at a budget price. What's worse, it took time and resources away from better options. Where the hell was Outrunners and Rail Chase? Why would Sega go back this far when so many other games never had any form of home port before? I don't know, man. There were so many games in their back catalog deserving of attention. I really didn't need to see these ancient releases again. Coming in as perhaps my most wanted Saturn English translation, right up there with Snatcher, is Phantasy Star Collection. I'm a big fan of these games, and even though I can easily play them on my Genesis, I've always wanted to play them through on my Saturn. You get Phantasy Star 2, Phantasy Star 3, and Phantasy Star 4. All of these feel quite different from one another, and they all have an appeal that separates them quite a bit. Aside from some art and additional media like commercials, these are the 8 and 16-bit versions in their original forms. No big changes to speak of, but they also play just like they should. Without being able to read Japanese, they are pretty useless to me right now, but I still own it in the hopes that someone will translate it someday so I can add it to my digital collection. In the absence of a new Phantasy Star on the Saturn, this was the best we'd get. Sometimes you just want good games, even if they're available elsewhere.
時を司るのは神か悪魔か一本で4つのエンディングキングオブ RPG 時の継承者ファンタシースター3
Sega knew that some of its Japanese Saturn Sega Ages conversions could possibly hold some appeal in Western markets, so they dropped Outrun, Afterburner, and Space Harrier onto a disc and called it Volume 1. Of course, these were 3 excellent conversions, but it's Outrun that stood out the most. This was mainly because we had not had an arcade-accurate Outrun at home before. The 32X had done respectable versions of Afterburner and Space Harrier, so these ports weren't quite as potent. Outrun, on the other hand, was even better than its arcade original, thanks to a new, faster, and smoother mode that really looked outstanding. The only black mark on this compilation was that Working Designs needed to remove the arranged soundtrack from Outrun in order to fit all 3 games on the disc. This was unfortunate, because the music in the original Japanese Sega Ages release was a big reason to own that version. Still, this is a great trip down memory lane and something that Sega should have done a lot more of a lot sooner. While Sega failed miserably getting a dedicated mainline Sonic on the Saturn, they did have the sense to bring the Genesis games to the platform. Of course, they didn't show up until 1997, nearly 3 years too late for it to matter. This is a compilation of Sonic, Sonic 2, Sonic 3, and Sonic & Knuckles. These titles keep their lock-on technology where applicable and had additional features like new difficulty levels and adding the spin dash to the first game. These were not done via emulation, and were full ports running on the Saturn from the ground up. You can feel the small differences in how it plays and sounds, but overall they are still very good games and still very much worth a play. Of course, the real star of this compilation was Sonic World, a 3D content viewer that allowed you to run around a level and choose various extra content like art and movies from the Sonic universe. This was both a pleasure and one hell of a bitter pill to swallow at the same time. It was cool because you got to see what a 3D Sonic may have looked and played like on the Saturn had the project been handled properly. The bad part was we never got that game and only have what is essentially a demo level showing you what could have been. It was the ultimate woulda coulda shoulda, and this compilation is a stark reminder of just how bad Sega messed up during the life of the Saturn. Capcom hit an absolute grand slam with 1997's Street Fighter Collection. This one had Super Street Fighter 2, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. It was the kind of package that made total sense because it included very different Street Fighter experiences. You get the duo of Super and Super Turbo, which was the maturation of the original Street Fighter 2 line of games. With Alpha 2 Gold, you also got the pinnacle of that series at the time. It also came in super affordable, costing just $39 at its North American release. As you know, the star here is Alpha 2 Gold, which is an even better version of the already killer port to the Saturn. Great roster of fighters, fantastic sound and visuals, and it's a complete package of fighting goodness. Super and Super Turbo are just icing on the cake and great bonus titles in between bouts of Alpha 2 Gold. The Japanese version of this, which was ironically full priced at its release, is the much cheaper option these days. You honestly won't find a better compilation on the Saturn, and I'd recommend this one all day long. Taito's Chase HQ Plus Special Criminal Investigation is a duo of superscalar type vehicle combat games that turned out pretty decent on Saturn. The control takes a bit of getting used to, but the visuals are nice and smooth. This came out in 1996, and while I can still enjoy it, it could have used a few more additions. Where was Super Chase, or maybe a few of the console-based spin-offs? The gameplay of these titles was fairly simple, and play sessions, once you got good, were pretty damn short. It really needed a few more diversions to merit its full price point. Today it's a curiosity you may want to mess around with via emulation or an ODE, but I can't say it's something you absolutely have to have. Thunder Force was an awesome series of shoot-'em-ups on the Sega Genesis. There was even an arcade spin-off actually based on the console version of Part 3. So it was no real surprise to see Technosoft try and recapture some of that magic with the Thunder Force Gold Pack series of compilations. There were two of these, with the first volume having Thunder Force 2 and Thunder Force 3. Volume 2 would have Thunder Force AC and Thunder Force 4. I am a big fan of these games, particularly 3 and 4. I think they look and sound as good as anything that was released that entire generation, and are absolute must-owns on the Genesis. The ports to the Saturn are very nice and provide an accurate representation of the originals. The problem here is that I feel there was no need at all to have two different releases for these games. All four should have been on one Thunder Force Gold Pack. While I feel these are all great shooters, there are no real upgrades to the sound or visuals, making just two per disc kinda suspect. On the plus side, these were budget releases in Japan and came in a bit cheaper than the average game. Even so, it would have been cool if Technosoft had upgraded all of these with improved colors, a few new background and foreground effects, and maybe a new remix soundtrack you could use if you wanted. Hell, they could have at least added the Sharp X68000 version of Thunder Force 2 and the Super Nintendo version of Thunder Spirits. As they are, you do get your score saved to the internal RAM, reduced slowdown, and the ship from Thunder Force 3 is usable in Thunder Force 4. These are great games, no doubt about it, but I feel the developers could have taken an extra step or two to really make these packages a lot more special. If you have watched my Sega CD videos, you know I love Road Avenger and Cobra Command. These full motion video games were just about the best that genre had to offer, and the arcade version showed up on the Saturn in one package. Called Thunderstorm and Road Blaster in Japan, these were originally Data East Laserdisc games. The quality of the video sees a massive upgrade here in both color and detail, giving you the feeling of a vastly superior product. And while I think these are very much worth playing, they have a few things different that lessen their impact. The music and sound effects are changed, and there are some visual differences that kinda impact the overall experience. Don't get me wrong, they're still a good time, I just prefer them on the Sega CD. I mean, Road Avenger just isn't the same without its iconic soundtrack. Very similar to Thunderstorm and Road Blaster, Time Gal and Ninja Hayate are two full-motion video titles bundled together for fans of the genre. This time you get two Taito-developed arcade releases, both character-driven instead of the vehicle-based action of the previous games. Both these titles saw Sega CD releases. Time Gal should be instantly familiar to many of you, while Ninja Hayate was known as Revenge of the Ninja. The two pretty much play the same. As the action plays out on the screen, you must press the appropriate direction or action button to move your character out of harm's way or cause a certain action to keep the story going. These also have vastly superior video quality to the Sega CD ports, giving you a much closer arcade experience. Since these are character-driven with more intricate stories, you'll be pleased to know that both games have an English option for you to enjoy. Like the Atari collection we looked at earlier, the Midway Presents Arcade Greatest Hits disc had a number of old titles for you to mess with. This time you get Defender, Defender 2, Joust, Robotron 2084, Sinistar, and Bubbles. Most of these are classics that you'll either love or are completely indifferent to. The question of age comes up again, primarily because there were only 6 games in this compilation. I mean, at the retail price this thing had, you would expect a lot more. Taken on their own merits, the games hold up just fine, with a few of these being staples of early 80s gaming. Grab a friend and games like Joust are worth their weight in gold. But with so few games, you can get far better options elsewhere for Midway's classics. The Twin Bee series is another cute 'em up in the Konami stable of shooters. This set here is the final two games in the series, Detana Twin Bee and Twin Bee Yahoo. These colorful vertically scrolling shoot 'em ups look and play great. Like Parodius, the humor in these games belies the challenge within. You think it's going to be a kid's game, but these can still give you a heck of a nasty fight. Shockingly, among Saturn games in this genre, this one tends to be really affordable today, often going for about $40 or so. I'd say that makes this disc well worth owning today, and I don't think any fan of the series will be disappointed with how they turned out. The only real negative is the heavy use of Japanese text and language, so there are times where you have no clue what the hell is happening. Our final compilation comes in the form of Image Fight and X Multiply via the Arcade Gears line of releases. Both of these are based on Irem arcade releases originally. Image Fight is a vertically scrolling shooter from 1988 that uses pods that attack from the sides of the ship and forces that attach to the front. You may think this is like R-Type, but it really isn't. One shot destroys your force and you'll need to get another. The Saturn port here has some rendering side effects that make the backgrounds look kinda rough. It's a decent game, but not one of my favorites. X Multiply, on the other hand, is much better. It was released in 1989 and has better visuals and a rather unique story. An alien invasion is taking place, but these little dudes are microscopic, and so you must find and kill their queen inside the body of a human colonist. The power-up system uses tentacle-like arms that you use to attack and defend yourself. I have always enjoyed this one and consider the Saturn port an excellent way to play it. Beware, both of these games can be really tough, so only those wanting a serious challenge need to apply. That does it for this episode on Sega Saturn Compilations. There are certainly a number of titles on this list worth looking into, and some offer up some serious value for what you're getting, even in today's crazy retro market. I suppose the biggest issue with some of these are that the developers didn't go far enough. While it was cool to see early Irem classics like Kung Fu Master, where were the other games they were responsible for? Sega had an awesome idea with the Ages line, but again, they concentrated on stuff we had already seen. Where were the games people had wanted for years, even at that point? Even when a compilation had great games, like the Thunder Force Gold packs, just 2 games per disc was kinda crappy, particularly since none had any real upgrades to the presentation. For those of you curious, there were a few outliers that I didn't include because they didn't fit my exact description of a compilation. The Arcade Gears Wonder 3 was actually 3 games in one, but it always came that way, even in the original arcade version. Some games would come with 2 versions of the same game, like Hyper Duel, which featured the arcade original and a special Saturn version with upgraded assets. I didn't include these since they were never standalone releases themselves. I also left off some of the Japanese-only titles that had multiple games in one release, like Langrisser Dramatic Edition, which was the first 2 games, and Wizardry 6 and 7 Complete. Hopefully someday these games and many others will see English translations so we can add even more games to our Sega Saturn libraries. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.